Ahmed, we might start. Well, welcome everyone. Professor Shahram Akbarzadeh. I'm convener of Middle East Studies Forum at Deakin University, and it's my great pleasure to be introducing and chairing this session with my colleague, Ahmed Hashim, who is Associate Professor of Strategic Studies at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Deakin Uni. He has more than 2 decades of research experience and leadership on security issues in the Persian Gulf with growing interest in the Pacific region. Ahmed is a new addition to Deakin University and joining us during the COVID pandemic. So we haven't actually had a chance to meet in person. I look forward to the time where we can actually sit and have a chat over coffee. We're privileged to have Ahmed with us at Deakin as a colleague and also as a member of Middle East Studies Forum. Associate Professor Hashim is involved in Deakin program at Canberra Center for Defense Studies. He has been working on a major book project for the past decade, and it is truly a labor of love. So it's a very much my pleasure to welcome Ahmed to share with us his insights on his forthcoming book on Iranian ways of war. Ahmed, the floor is yours.
Okay, share screen. Where is it? Okay, can everybody see that?
That's perfect.
Yeah. Oh, merci, Shahram. That was a kind introduction. And I'm going to start right away because although I have a lot of slides here, I'm just going to go through a few of them. Before I start, I just want to say these are my personal opinions that I am addressing here. They do not represent the views of any institution that I'm affiliated with, neither Deakin nor the Canberra Center for Defense Studies. So let me move. Okay, this is the book as it will appear sometime in the coming year. This is a mural of the Difa'am al-Qaddas. Was painted in Tehran several years ago. Now, let me just, I'm just going to go very quickly through the table of contents and then we'll address the issue. Obviously, the book is roughly about 900 pages. So the way I've organized it is with the introduction, the preface, and a theory chapter that originally ran to about 100 pages, but I was persuaded to cut it down to half that size. So I will be addressing that very quickly. And this is how the book actually, table of contents, goes. When I say Iranian ways of war, I'm not talking about just the Islamic Republic of Iran. I'm talking about the history, martial history of Iran from the Achaemenian Empire right through to the Islamic Republic of Iran. So it's not just as I said, a contemporary. It's an objective military history and strategic studies analysis. It's not a political or politicized study of what's going on here. Okay, so let's see. Yes, so very quickly through the table of contents. This is the table of contents that it's looking at the history and the way Iran does warfare. So let me just...
Ahmed, we don't see the table of contents now. You stopped sharing. Can you start again?
Yeah, sorry, somebody
accidentally shared their screen. So if we can all avoid that, that would be great.
Okay, so now, and it basically ends with an analysis of how the Islamic Republic of Iran would fight if it has to go to war. So I'm just going to move very quickly and address the context, the methodological and conceptual context of Iranian ways of war. As I said, it is not a politicized, Iran is a very controversial topic, and I'm not interested in doing that, taking the side of the Islamic Republic or of its enemies. I am looking at Iran without what we call military Orientalism, which was actually begun by the Greeks, going back to the Greco-Iranian wars. It is a military history, strategic studies, and historical sociological analysis of how Iran fights and why it fights the way it does, which now brings me to the conceptual framework. What is a way of warfare? A way of warfare is a concept in strategic studies which addresses two issues: how somebody fights and why they fight the way they fight. It's not about the causes of war, of a war between two belligerents, but how the topic of discussion, Iran's military, why Iran has fought the way it has, and why it fights the way it does. And of course, a way of warfare is not static. It is, it's dynamic. The Sasanian way of warfare cannot be the same as the Qajari or the Safavid. Things change. Now, the concept of way of warfare was first addressed by military historians in the 1930s, Basil Liddell Hart. Then it migrated into strategic studies, which is the area that I am in. The problem here is that in strategic studies or in political science, people confuse it with something called strategic culture. Strategic culture is any elite's view of how war, of their national security, and how their country might need to fight a war. It is not the same as a way of war, but they are linked, because how an elite views war translates into ultimately how that country thinks about, prepares for, and fights its wars. So, very quickly, and I'm not going to go through each imperial era, but look at the Achaemenian way of war. Here you have a massive military that was dominated by the nobility, which was the key branch of the imperial military, because the nobility had the money, the power, and as a result of this, most of Iran's military under the Achaemenian Empire was cavalry. Cavalry was the prestige arm. Infantry was mainly from the peasants, client empires, and Greek vassal states. Mercenaries were very important. Logistics were very well done in the Achaemenian Empire. But there was a lot about the Achaemenian military which was negative. It was a prestige military designed in many ways to legitimize the great king, to instill awe, and to deter enemies. When it actually came to fight in many ways, it had issues. Because this was a large empire, it was a divided military with so many regional and ethno-religious units speaking different languages, having different interests, making it cumbersome and unwieldy, with a similarity to the Austro-Hungarian military on the eve of World War I, where 17 languages, distinct languages, European languages, were spoken within that military. Imagine how many there were within the Achaemenian military. Nonetheless, this military, and by the way, people like Herodotus used to say 2.5 million Iranian soldiers. And I use the term Iran, not Persia, because it was the Greeks who called them Persians, not the Iranians. This was always Iran Shah and not Persia. Persia is a small, is a significant province, Fars, obviously. So basically, Herodotus said 2.5 million Achaemenian soldiers invaded Greece. Impossible. A German historian, Hans Delbrück, did a study, and he said in one of the battles, when the first Iranian soldiers appeared at Thermopylae, the logistics was just leaving Susa in in Iran, 2.5 million soldiers and their camp followers. He said this was not logically possible. Even then, when you look at what invaded under Xerxes the Greek mainland, roughly 250,000 soldiers was a impressive logistical feat on the part of the Iranians. But Greece was poor. It could not handle that amount of soldiery to fight in Greece. And it was a logistical nightmare ultimately for the Iranian commanders to deal with such a large force. So let's move on to the Parthian Empire. The Parthian Empire was more a tribal empire. It was more decentralized. Again, it had no resources or capabilities to centralize power. But just like the Achaemenian Empire, it was focused on heavy cavalry called cataphracts. And the cataphracts were the forerunners of feudal knights. What the Parthian Empire's enemy was Rome, not Greece. The Parthians could not project power because they didn't have the capability, but they could defend against Rome's ability to project power into Iran. And often when they came into Iran or Mesopotamia, which is now modern Iraq, which were the centers of gravity, the Parthians won against Rome because of their heavy cataphract way of warfare, as well as people's war, scorched earth. So very, this gives you a flavor what the Parthian military looked like. It's like the feudal knights, but let me just go very quickly. The same thing with the Sasanian Empire. The conclusion I came to after looking the three ancient empires basically was out of Robert Brown, The World of Late Antiquity. This is really critical to how the ancient empires conducted war. The monarchy depends on the army in all three. The army on money. Money comes from the land tax. The land tax comes from agriculture. For ancient Iranian way of warfare, you had to have all these in balance for them to create an effective military capability. So a just king, taxation, land on agriculture to provide the funds. So everything had to be in balance for Iran to be able to conduct warfare during the ancient empires. Now, I won't have time to go through all of these, but now I move to the Islamic empires from the Safavid, Afsharid, and Qajar. None of them managed to centralize power. None of them managed to commercialize the economy successfully. There was rampant corruption, and particularly in the Qajar era, there were attempts by a number of officials like Amir Kabir and others to reform and create a nizam jadid. It did not succeed because of vested interests, lack of money, corruption, and lack of a taxation base. But last but not least, their foreign interference in Iran's affairs begins in a massive way during the Qajar era. And the Qajars realized that they had to reform their military, but only a few of them understood that you couldn't have an effective military with a rotten state structure. And the Qajar military was truly a rotten structure. And in fact, it fractured into several entities that were ultimately controlled by Russia and Britain. And even though they tried to bring in foreign missions to fix the army, these missions never succeeded for a wide variety of reasons, including the existence of corruption, lack of monetary resources, and the fact that the missions just did not have sufficient effect on changing the military establishment, but it's actually a larger issue than that. For modernization to succeed, as a lot of perspicacious Iranian officials discovered and foreign observers, was for society to change. And that wasn't going to happen under the Qajar era. Now, Reza Khan to Reza Pahlavi. Under Reza Pahlavi, Iran was changing from an empire to a modern nation state. Empires fight their ways differently from nation states. And a lot of this has to do with the concept of changing from the notion of frontiers to borders, territorial sovereignty, rather than defending peripheral regions in an empire which required regional forces. And regional forces were always not under the control of the central power, often under controls of provisional governors or satraps in the case of the ancient empires. But you have now a centralized military, technical and organizational modernization, because notions of modernization really took off at that time under Reza Khan. And the army was an instrument of national modernization, development, and centralization. So it fought internal centrifugal forces, but as an instrument of modern interstate warfare, it failed miserably. Now, that is not to say Iran could have beaten Britain and Russia when they invaded in 1941, I think, when they invaded, but it could have done better. It did not. Now I want to move very quickly to the Pahlavi dynasty. We don't have time for all of this. Muhammad Reza Shah created one of the most advanced militaries in what was then called the Third World. But it was not an effective military. This is really important to understand. It, for a wide a lot of Iranians were like impressed and awed by the what I call the prestige factor of the Pahlavi military from 1970s to the decline, to the revolution. It could not do combined arms. It could not do joint warfare. And I'll explain these in a moment. It did not fight a major war, but it did not fight effectively in the one war it actually fought in Dhofar, Oman. I managed to get hold of British declassified documents because Britain was fighting in Oman against communist insurgents alongside the Pahlavi military. And they said they were just, except for the logistics capability and firepower, they were awful. The gap between the officers and enlisted men was a reflection of the state of society. They could not do combined arms, and it was a rigid, inflexible force. Now, when you look at the Pahlavi military, at one point, the Shah was attending naval gunnery exercises in the Persian Gulf. And during the exercise, the entire gunnery exercise, the fleet missed all their targets. So the Shah went back to one of his officers and he said, I'm trying to, create an effective military with these cretins, or as we call them in the United States. And he said, I've spent all this money on what's turned out to be a empty prestige military. Now, this is a really significant aspect of the ineffectiveness of the Shah's military. What is combined arms? Combined arms is when the ground forces, armor, infantry, artillery, all work together in a synergistic manner. They work together to fight together. They could not do that in the Pahlavi military because the Shah would not allow officers from different branches to get together. He was well aware of what happened in his Arab neighbors, including next door in Iraq. civil military relations were not very well, were very unstable. So when officers came together, the potential for plotting could take place, which is why the Shah played a big role in deciding who would be promoted and on what basis. And the basis was not primarily professionalism, it was primarily who would not be a threat to the Pahlavi dynasty. So you have and then what we call joint warfare, which is getting the services, meaning the army, the Air Force and Navy, to work together, was also not a part of the imperial system. Now, Islamic Republic of Iran came in with the view, what's called dumbing down the Shah's military. There was obviously the suspicion of the imperial military for political reasons, but the mentality was that a very high-tech military creates dependency and not effective military capability. So that's what's meant by dumbing down the Shah's military. You know, the view was we no longer need to be a regional policeman of the Persian Gulf on behalf of the Shaitan-e-Bozorg, so we don't need all this equipment. And in fact, the over-technologization of the military under the Pahlavi regime was not in accord or in parallel with the development of Iran at that time. So you have people with basic literacy trying to handle expensive equipment like chieftain tanks and not succeeding. A lot of the imperial military's chieftain tanks were always in maintenance or broken down. Yet the Air Force had created a very good technical services, the Homafars. But the Homafars were anti the regime, and they were the ones who fought with the Imperial Guard at Lavizan barracks in at the end of the Pahlavi dynasty. Let me just advance. Now, I have to briefly talk about, this is the most important aspect of Iran's national security. You cannot understand the Islamic Republic without understanding the impact of the Difa Muqaddas or the Jang Tahmili on popular, political, and strategic cultures. Now, very briefly on this part, because the chapter on it is about 100 pages and does a military analysis. This was revolutionary warfare in the sense that when a country undergoes a revolution, just like France, Russia, and China, you have initial unpreparedness of the revolutionary forces. There is the way they approach war is, as Martin White, the English IR theorist, said, is that they're crusades for righteousness. And there is turmoil within the armed forces. You find that in Iran, France, Russia, and China. You also find that the revolutionaries are suspicious of the ancien regime military, so they create a dual military structure, which is why they created the Sepah-e Pasdaran to check the regular Artesh. And then there is that interesting juxtaposition between expert and Maktabi, doctrinarian, in the Iranian military approach. In other words, between those who believe in technology and a technological approach and those who believe in an ideological approach. And this, of course, had an impact on the discordant civil-military relations in the early years of the Islamic Republic, particularly the conflict between Bani Sadr, the technocrats and the Artesh, versus the Maktabis and the Sepah. And of course, it also affected civil-military relations in the prosecution of the war. In 1982, the big debate, do we continue into Iraq or not? In 1988, do we terminate or carry on? And of course, everything then reverted back to the supreme leader. The Iranian way of war was lack of combined arms and joint warfare. The impact of the dualistic military was quite deleterious at the beginning because it had an impact on command, control, and coordination of distinct forces with different cultures and mentalities. And so here you have this juxtaposition also between firepower, faith, and the nullification of Iran's demographic superiority over Iraq. It had 3 times the population, but it could not mobilize. The Supreme War Council could not effectively mobilize Iranian society and for the war effort to fight against Iraq. Iraq per capita mobilized more manpower on the front. Admittedly, it had to keep its soldiers on the front line for much longer than Iran. Now, what was interesting, that most of Iran's successes came in infiltration, flank attacks, and night operations, including the attack on the Fao Peninsula in 1986. And I don't have time to go through the lessons, but let me give you the strategic guidelines and end with where Iran is. As a result of the lessons, Iran came out with strategic guidelines in 89, actually 88, 89, which looking to the future. And this is really remarkable because when I also looked at the PLA, when when Deng Xiaoping reformed post-Maoist PRC, they came out with something called a strategic guideline for the PLA after the end of the Maoist era. Iran issued strategic guidelines from 88 that are dynamic and basically evolve with the time. Who will Iran fight? Of course, from 1988 to 1991, when Iraq was defeated, the key enemy was Iraq. 1988 to 1991, and then it was no longer the key enemy after its defeat in Desert Storm. Who will Iran fight? I'm just summarizing it. Where will Iran fight? What kind of wars will Iran fight? How will Iran fight? And what is Iran's conception of victory, particularly against stronger powers? Okay, we don't have time for this. I want to go straight into how would Iran fight? Political warfare, subconventional warfare, conventional warfare are important issues. Political warfare, by the way, is not just conducted by Iran. A lot of people accuse Iran of doing all kinds of skullduggery in the Middle East and further afield. Political warfare is conducted by Western liberal democracies. In fact, the definition here that I have is from George Kennan, an American, who said, we are going to face communist Russia using political warfare. It's done by Iran throughout the Middle East. It's done by other countries against Iran and by Iran against those countries. Now, political warfare gives you a power projection capability, forward defense, so to speak. So this is one form of warfare that Iran conducts. And some of the means of political warfare to promote soft power or to defend against soft attacks, tahajjum farhangi, against Iran's way of life by the outsiders. So there's a whole series of ways to do it. There's also subconventional warfare, which is not the same as political warfare, but don't misunderstand me and assume that they do not necessarily go together. Warfare has now become a spectrum of conflict that is waged in a scalar manner. You could be conducting political warfare, subconventional warfare, or even conventional warfare. And this was pointed out by the chief of the Russian staff, not an Iranian, Gerasimov, who said warfare has a spectrum of conflict which ranges from political warfare, subconventional to conventional. And Iran hit on this idea as well. And you can see it being practiced by Iran in throughout the Middle East, and other countries are doing the same thing as well. Now, of course, conventional war is where Iran is seriously worried, and I'll explain why here. We don't have time, as I said, to do this. I want to end with the restructuring of Iran's conventional military right now. Lessons learned from the Iran-Iraq war and from the US wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Israel-Hezbollah war of 2006 were among the most important lessons learned by Iran. First of all, this juxtaposition between maktabi and technical is, they said it's not a juxtaposition, they are all important. Technology and, we call it maktabi, but if you want to just look at it objectively, it's national cohesion, social cohesion, and military cohesion as well. So you can call it ideological indoctrination. In a Western sense, we call it national cohesion and the willingness to fight. But technology is important. Secondly, Iran has created the second largest S&T and R&D infrastructure in the Middle East, and is the second most sophisticated after those of Israel. It has problems, no doubt, partly as a result of sanctions, which has crimped it, partly as a result of rampant corruption. But if you look at the ability of Iran to the output, the scientific and technological output of Iran, it is a most impressive achievement. Iran has also interacted with the PRC and the DPRK, North Korea, on learning lessons of war and how to deal with stronger powers. Now, and I will finish here, Shahram, so please bear with me. When looking at warfighting, potential warfighting, remember how I said the strategic guidelines. What are the most dangerous conventional threat? The United States is number one without a saying. I mean, Iran pays a lot of attention to what the United States says or does and the development of its military capabilities in and the power projection capabilities in the proximity of the Islamic Republic. And secondly, Israel. Now, I'm not going to lump these necessarily together, but if you see Yahya Rahim Safavi, then IRGC commander in 2008, our enemy strategy is based on air and sea operations. Who is our enemy? It's a country that will come from beyond the Persian Gulf, okay? And that can be America, or as they ideologically refer to it, the Zionist regime. What Iran also has said, what Iranian officers from the Artesh and the IRGC have also said, is that we do not believe a full invasion of Iran will be attempted. A full invasion will not be attempted. There seems to be lessons learned by outsiders of trying to invade Iran, and negative lessons learned about the American experience in Iraq and Afghanistan over the past several years has kind of crimped that ability or the willingness to get bogged down. But what Iran fears in terms of ground operation or even air attack are amphibious landings adjacent to Khuzestan, the oil-rich province of Iran. It's essentially basically grabbing Iran and holding it hostage. It's also flat. It is the center of gravity of the Islamic Republic in terms of its economic resources. You can't go through Khuzestan directly because the terrain there doesn't lend itself to ease of amphibious operations. They will have to come either through Iraq and then enter Khuzestan as the Iraqis did, based on several plans that the Iraqis had and the British and the Iraqis had developed when Iraq was under British control, or they will have to come on the other flank and then march into Khuzestan. The other thing they fear is large-scale soft operations throughout the width and breadth of Iran by US and Israeli special operations forces to attack critical infrastructure. And the most frightful thing of all for them, worrisome, is aerial operations throughout the width and breadth of Iran to hit strategic targets, particularly those associated with nuclear infrastructure. And then naval assaults in the Persian Gulf, hitting Iranian assets, infrastructure, and economic targets. The Arab countries Iran does not fear their ground capabilities, but the air forces of Saudi Arabia and the UAE are an issue. But what Iran fears most is the use of Arab bases and installations by US and Israeli forces. Secondly, what should Iran do? Well, of course, you need to deter, but what if deterrence fails? You identify the enemy's weak points to attack those and not strike their strong points, their weak points. The other thing which Iran says it will do is we will not play by the enemy's rules. Because if Iran plays by the enemy's rules, it's going to lose. And this is a lesson learned from the disastrous naval engagement in 1988 against the US Navy. What structure do you need? And this is the final thing. What force structure, doctrine, and capabilities? Iran has abolished the heavy divisional structures of the regular army and the IRGC and has created modular brigades that are independent of each other. And so command, control, and communications has been decentralized to lower levels in case link with the national command authority is broken. Dispersal of and redundancy and military and civil infrastructure. And one of the most important aspects is the creation of a vast and relatively sophisticated ballistic missile command and ballistic missiles, because Iran has not been able to redevelop its air force with 4th and 5th generation fighters. It's essentially, the air force is essentially a 1970s relic of historical planes kept flying, but they will not work very well. There was a major enlargement of the special operations forces capability to deal with enemy SOF in case they invade Iran. And in the Persian Gulf, it's going to be naval asymmetric warfare with the IRGCN playing a role. So in effect, even though it cannot create what we call an anti-access, area denial anti-access like China is doing, what Iran wants to do is present the US and its allies with a differentiated, multi-layered set of capabilities that that will create as much damage as possible before it's unraveled through a process of attrition. And then, let's see. I won't have time to go through the intensive analysis of the actual structure. So basically, I'm going to end here and take questions.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. That's fascinating. The wide breadth of the coverage is amazing. If you stop sharing your screen, we'll see everyone on the screen. And please use the raise hand function to ask a question. I'm having trouble with my own command here. Various things popping up. Okay, while people are thinking about the questions they like to ask, and I should remind everyone that if you bring your cursor on the reaction function, which is a circle towards the right, a happy face on my screen, and you press on it, it will give you the option of raising hand. Now, my question to you, Ahmed, is about the creation of Sepah Pastaran and the parallel structure that exists now between the Revolutionary Guards and the regular army. How does that work in practice, and what are the pros and cons of having two parallel structures?
First of all, there are, from my perspective, there are more cons than pros. It really doesn't work very well. Even though the Artesh has been brought under ideological control and so on since the revolution, there's something called the IPD, which is equivalent to the Soviet and the Chinese conception of a political commissar system. And in the case of Iran, a lot of them, they were mostly clerics that were integrated into the armed forces to ensure ideological coherence and belief in the Nizam of the Islamic Republic. Now, the problems
and by Nizam, you mean the system?
The system. The problems go back to the Iran-Iraq war. First of all, the organizational culture of both is different, of the two institutions is totally different. The Artesh was trained to conduct conventional, high-tech conventional warfare, or jang-e classique, as they call it. The Sepah was trained to conduct irregular warfare and to be a protector of the Nizam against counter-revolutionaries, and also to keep an eye on the Artesh. So they didn't work very well during the first year and a half of the Iran-Iraq war. Bani Sadr was an irritant in that respect, but when you saw some of Iran's failed offensives, like the armor battle in Susangerd and others, there was no coordination between the two forces. And at one time, the Pasdaran would go off and do something in the field without telling the army, and vice versa. Or the Pasdaran would accuse the army of not supporting them with artillery. Remember, this is the time before the Sepah had organic artillery, armor, and so on. So it relied on the army, but there was total different culture. Now, another aspect that causes problems is duplication of resources. And this was something that Hashim Rafsanjani pointed out to, as well as Ayatollah Montazeri pointed out in 1988. One of the, Hashim Rafsanjani said in early June 1988, when Iran started its, just before it accepted the poison chalice, as Khomeini said, they started, the lesson early said, Hashim Rafsanjani said, we've wasted so much by duplication of resources. So the Sepah was like, oh my God, he's going to disband us. They said, no, we're not going to disband you, but we are going to rationalize and create more effective structure for the defense forces, which is why they created the Ministry of Defense and Logistics and Torkan, in the early 90s, to create rationality and rationalization between the two. Another aspect, Shahram, is that the Pasdaran is a defender of the Nizam. The Artesh sees itself as the defender of the nation state. It's a nationalist entity, even under the Islamic Republic. And there's an element of jealousy. And for a long time, the Artesh was really kind of, excuse the language, pissed off that the Sepah would get all the credit for the Difa' Muqaddas. They published all this stuff. The army was nowhere. I've got a lot of the stuff, and it's about 80% Sepah Pasdaran origin that I've managed to get my hand on for the study of the Iran-Iraq war. Then so there was this problem a year and a half ago when Admiral Habibullahi, I think, cast some aspersions about the Sepah that created a stir in society, in political circles. So there was an element of civil-military relations here. Now, the other problem is that the Sepah Pasdaran has deprofessionalized over a number of years, in the sense now, is this again the same thing similar to the PLA, business enterprises, until Deng Xiaoping said to the PLA, the more you engage in business activities and have a business conglomerate, you're not going to be effective in your profession. So the Pasdaran, so it creates some jealousy in the army that they have all these resources, but at the same time, there is a recognition that the Sepah Pasdaran is more interested in making money than fighting wars. You know, one of the Sepah officers in Azerbaijan had millions of dollars in his bank account and cannot have been from his salary.
Okay. Thanks, Brother Ahmed. I see two people have raised hands. So Ben, would you like to ask the first question?
Yeah, thank you, Ahmed. Really a fascinating paper, and really rich. And I don't think I've ever seen anybody do sort of 3,500 years of military history with such grace. So kudos to you. It's going to be a wonderful book, and obviously put a lot of time and research into it. I actually have a bunch of questions, but I won't ask them all because I'm conscious of it.
Offline.
Yeah, we can do it another time. But the one thing that sort of, among a few questions, but the one thing that really stands out that you didn't talk much about, that I'd be really interested to hear more about, is Iran's increasing reliance on proxy forces to solve its problems in the region, and the ways in which it has supported and used these proxy forces, whether they be in Yemen or Syria or in Lebanon, to solve broader sort of geopolitical problems. Yeah. And the extent to which these proxy forces play into Iran's vision of, you know, you paint a sort of a picture of what Iran may or may not do, and what Iran fears most, and how does that fit with its sort of geopolitical influence, given its proxy forces in the region? Thanks.
Okay, yeah, it's something I had to gloss over, obviously, in the talk, but there's an entire chapter in the book on proxy war. I call it subconventional because, you know, even though there's a significant proxy element, you will find that Iran has actually put Sepah Pasdaran and the 22nd Airborne Special Forces into Syria as well. So there is regular elements of the Iranian military from the dual military, as well as proxy forces. Now, proxy forces are not, as we all know, are not a new thing. Countries have been using proxy forces. Go back to the Greek-Iranian wars, or proxy forces were used by both sides. The empires, Iran's empires, used proxy forces in the past. So it's not just an element of the Islamic Republic as a revolutionary power defending Shia against marauding Sunni extremism. It goes beyond that. It is an essential element of Iran's forward defense, which you also find that, you know, the Achaemenians, the Sasanians, the Parthians, forward defense against the enemy. So if you can do forward defense to prevent him from coming to your center of gravity, why not, if you want to look at it in those terms? Iran's lucky, and by the way, this is another aspect that's almost always ignored. The Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, engaged in proxy warfare in the Middle East against his enemies. The Arab nationalists in favor of the Shia. He used Savak and other proxy elements to promote forward defense of the Pahlavi dynasty. So, and Iran is not the only user of it, but Iran has an in, so to speak, because it has these Shia minorities that give it that in to be able to. Now, Khomeini said when they came into power in 1979, he said, this is an Islamic revolution. It's ecumenical, but by default, with the increase in sectarian attacks on Shia throughout, as a result of the rise of Salafism, Salafi jihadism, and essentially the breakdown of the Arab state structure and so on, the Shia have come in for a lot of opprobrium, going back to, oh, they are the fifth column, tabur khamis, as they say in Arabic, of the foreigners. So Iran feels ideologically at one level compelled to support them, but here's where you have the nexus between revolutionary rhetoric and maslahat dawlat, the national security, forward defense. So it's not just revolutionary practices, which may have been prevalent in the 1980s when they were creating all kinds of havoc in places like Bahrain, for example. This is a nexus between national security and support for a religious kin that find themselves being oppressed. But at the same token, when you come down to stark realism, supporting proxy forces in Iraq was also relevant to keep regional as well as extra-regional enemies in check. Iran supported Shia proxy forces to make it difficult for the US. It at one point supported the Taliban to make it difficult for the US in Afghanistan, and it supports the Houthis. And Iran was a newcomer to this conflict, by the way, to basically keep Saudi Arabia and the UAE in check or preoccupied, mired in a war that they cannot win, because remember, Iran's involvement in the Houthi rebellion saw an uptick when Saudi and Emirati rhetoric against Iran saw an uptick as well. So there is that aspect to it.
There is a follow-up question. I see Vladimir has raised his hand. Vladimir, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, I think, thank you. I think there was someone else who had raised their hand before me, but my question sort of follows up on this, sort of Ben's question on the proxies. So, I mean, super interesting. Thank you very much. Very, very much worth waking up at 5 for this.
Thank you, Vladimir. I was just reading your article on proxy war for a course I was teaching.
And right, you should. Thank you very much.
It was great.
Everyone knows. So I think it is interesting you draw this sort of distinction between the conventional and sort of sub-conventional, but one of the things that sort of came out, especially when there was sort of the tensions between Trump and sort of Iran, was like, how might Iran sort of integrate this should there be a sort of a conventional conflict? So I was wondering whether you would be as kind as to speculate a bit in the case of a sort of an actual conflict. In what way would sort of Iran integrate its conventional capability with sort of the proxy forces? Thank you.
The way Iran sees the use of proxies right now is, and I forgot to mention this, is also to prevent an outbreak of war by showing what it can do throughout the region. Okay, so it's a form of preempting an attack on Iran, showing that, you know, we have a forward defense that prevents this. But in the case of a direct attack on Iran, and I think most Iranians, whether it's Artesh or Sepah Pasdaran, and you know, I've talked to, given my links obviously with Iran in many ways, and I know a lot of former military people, including, you know, from visits back there, which are increasingly restricted for me. They don't think Iran will be invaded. Okay, so the old that conception, what we call people in arms conception, of fighting within Iran's territory in an asymmetric people's war. Remember and here again I refer to China. Before Deng Xiaoping's reforms of the PLA, the Chinese view was that you know, we can't face the Soviet Union or the United States, so we'll wait for them to attack us if they're stupid enough and invade China. And we will confront them with people's war. The problem with people's war is you can't project power with people's war, okay? But what if threats come outside? People's war fails. So you have people's war under modern condition. For Iran, people's war under modern condition is forward defense beyond Iran's territory. Okay? Now, I doubt very much if the proxy forces will all leave their own territorial base to come and fight in Iran if there is a people's war. But then look at it this way. It's unlikely anybody's going to invade Iran with ground forces in a major way. So the biggest threat Iran will face is aerial war or soft operating on its territory in a major way. Proxy forces are not going to help Iran in any sense in that way. They cannot integrate those guys to defend Iran against aerial attack or special operations forces. That is an Iran thing. And so that means Iran's air defenses have to be improved dramatically. And that's a big problem for Iran right now. So I think an aerial attack by the US or Israel will really cause havoc in Iran, which is why what we call the passive defense of dispersal. Another aspect they worry about is large-scale enemy special operations forces on Iranian territory. So if as a result of this, you have seen what I call the modular development of the Iranian forces into decentralized mosaic defense structure to defend against enemy landing in parts of Iran. Because that's a possibility that could happen. Then you see a significant enlargement of both Artesh and Sepah Pasdaran special operating forces to counter that. So there is the aerial attack, there is the soft in Iran, and there's the naval assault in the Persian Gulf. The proxy forces are not really naval trained. None of the Arab proxy forces have a naval capability. They're not the LTTE in Sri Lanka. Hezbollah is the most potent non-state actor in the world right now, but it's ballistic missiles and its own special operations forces, which it's not going to come to Iran. It's holding the forward defense. And they're also, but the other thing is we tend to neglect is that a lot of the proxy forces are quite independent. You know, Iran doesn't, it's not a puppet master that controls them from some nerve center in Tehran in this sort of evil, Dr. Evil kind of fashion.
Thank you, Ahmed. We do have time for a final question. Alex, if you don't mind unmuting yourself and keeping the question brief, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Apologies if my camera is not on, but today my webcam doesn't like me much. First, just a very great presentation, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. My question is basically a historical role of mercenary in the Iranian way of war. Thank you very much.
Ah, yes, mercenaries. If you look at mercenaries, they've been actually quite relevant in the Iranian way of war, going back to Achaemenian times. Some of the most potent fighters in the Achaemenian military were Greek mercenaries. And you know, one of the things that I really hate in studying, you know, is the appearance of what we call Orientalism and studying Greco-Iranian relations is this view that this was a contest between East and West. Iran ruled over what was known as the Asiatic Greeks in Anatolia, Asia Minor. They were subjects of Iran. And it also had allies in the Greek mainland. And a lot of the real infantry force of the Achaemenian Empire were Greek mercenaries. And one of the key commanders of the Iranian army whom the nobility should have listened to, was a Greek who said, if you want to face Alexander with his powerful combined arms phalanx Macedonian army, the way to do it is through asymmetric warfare, as not to present yourself face to face with him. They said, oh, absolutely not. To do that is dishonorable, just like the French knights at Agincourt and Crécy and so on. Oh, no, we're not going to draw the English in. We're going to fight symmetrically. And of course, they got wiped out by a better trained military. Okay, so they've played an important role. The other thing is, if you fast forward, Russian deserters played a big role in the Qajar military. Russian deserters who didn't want to fight for the Tsar were an important element. And also remember, talking about the foreign impact on the Iranian armed forces, the British created a semi-independent South Persia rifles. The Russians created the Cossack Brigade. These were all Iranians, but commanded by foreigners, Russian Cossacks, and so on. So you have a history, and like in many empires, you have mercenaries, because, you know, Achaemenian Empire was large, just like the Roman Empire. The Romans had mercenaries, they called them auxiliaries. You know, Gauls and Germans and so on. For an odd reason, the Romans, the only people the Romans did not recruit into their army were Jews. They hated them for their monotheistic beliefs and their tendency to rebel all the time. But they recruited Gauls, they recruited Germans, Africans, and Iberians, and even Arabs far away. They managed to get into the Arabian Peninsula to recruit Arabs into as auxiliaries. So Iran had mercenaries. It had to have mercenaries by virtue also of the fact that they defended the peripheral regions of the empire. So it had Turkic mercenaries, it had Arab mercenaries, it had, as I said, Greek mercenaries. They've been an essential element of the imperial Iranian militaries.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Ahmed. Thanks so much for sharing your insights.
You're welcome.
And your book with us. This is going to be a groundbreaking publication. We look forward to seeing it out next week.
No, it's not out next week, next year.
Next year. I am in a hurry, Ahmed, I'm in a hurry.
I wish it was out next week because I can put it to rest.
Exactly, exactly. So thanks again for joining us. I know time was short and you did an amazing job covering so much information, cramming it into a 1 hour session. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Before everyone logs off, I'd like to remind everyone that we are going to have another webinar on the 28th. On 28th of October, we're going to have a session on Iraqi women participation in peace building by Dr. Yasmin Chilmiran. So until the 28th, I bid you well.